So looking at your career spanning of what you've done so far, you've done one short, one doc, and a lot of TV. What about the feast drew you into wanting to make this your directorial debut for a feature?
Well, I mean, I guess I wanted to. There were three things really. It's the three P's I say. It was passion. It was passion for horror. I used to watch kind of inappropriate horror films at a very young age, and used to love them. And it's also a passion for Wales and for the Welsh language and for our stories, for our heritage and our folklore. And I felt that those things had not been seen on a global stage before. The second P, I guess, would be pragmatism. I realized in order to tell these culturally specific stories, I'd probably have to use a genre that was sort of that transcended cultural barriers, to sort of Trojan horse the story in. So hence the going back to horror again. And then the third P, I guess, is politics. I wanted to talk about the history of the country in which I live, and to kind of push that out there, and to talk about kind of the way the country's been exploited in a way over the centuries, and then draw a link between that exploitation and that sort of injustice and the climate crisis that's facing us now. This kind of huge problem that humanity has to face up to. And it seems to me there was a link between those two things. On the one hand, a very local story about abusing nature, and then on the other hand, this sort of rather universal story about abusing the fragile planet on which we live. So it was all of that really that fed into my desire to tell this story.
Makes total sense. And you mentioned as you were younger, you watched horror movies that you were probably too young to see. Did any of that inspire you in your direction of the feast, or is this just like piecing together everything you envisioned for it?
I used to love those movies. Like, I think it was being scared was the thing that kind of really attracted me, and being scared within the sort of safe confines of one's own living room or cinema or whatever, So in terms of influence, I think what's kind of influenced me more actually is this crop of movies that we've had over the last decade, horror movies that we've had over the last decade, Raw or some of the Ari Aster stuff or Jordan Peele, those movies with I guess you'd call them elevated horror films with a message, and it's those films that have really inspired me, I have to say. It's just a chance, in my television work. You mentioned my career earlier. Like, I've been directing television for 9 years, and in a way, I haven't really had a chance to fully author something, and it seemed to me that this was my chance to kind of just say something about the world. So did those early slashers influence me? Yes, of course, a little bit, but probably what influenced me more was this sort of new crop of elevated horror films that we've seen over the last few years.
Yeah, and I definitely feel the feast fits in that category of elevated horror. I really like that too. Like, it's not like your typical slasher. It's not like, it can't be specifically categorized to one type of horror. And I really love that about, as you mentioned, the new horrors, and especially the feast. Like, it's not all psychological. It's not like slasher. It doesn't click any one box and only one box. And I like that it kind of broadly defines
absolutely there. Yeah, and I think that was my intention. I kind of, like, some people will say that maybe it doesn't feel like a cohesive whole because it does sort of traverse different types of horror, but that's what I love about it. It starts in a very, other than the sort of the pre-title sequence, it starts in a very naturalistic vein.
Yeah.
And then as the characters kind of psychologically disintegrate, then the structure of the piece sort of disintegrates, and tonally it becomes a very different beast, and it becomes far more expressionistic and then incredibly theatrical towards the end. And it's a bit sort of, Argento, or it becomes rather kind of Grand Guignol kind of feel to it. So it's this really sort of strange beast that morphs into something else, which I think is, I mean, I really like, because that's what I did. So, but I think that's the charm of it, actually.
Yeah, no, it's very beautifully done. I really like that, and the way it all comes together and just keeps shifting and always keeps the audience like on the edge of their seat, kind of. Because you never know exactly what's going to happen. Everything's like very like, oh wait, and then this, but like it slowly builds, and there's never like a point in the movie where I'm thinking I can predict what's going to happen next.
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, the point is, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that slow burn thing. I'm a really big, as well as being a big fan of horror, I'm a really big fan of some of that slow cinema that we see. Some of the more kind of I guess European art house slow cinema. And definitely the first 30 minutes of the film is a bit slow cinema-ish. But what I love about slow cinema is it kind of allows the audience to sort of immerse in the piece, and to kind of really almost kind of marinate in the mood of it, rather than like a piece of television where you're kind of constantly being fed narrative. And I think some audiences are intimidated by that slowness, by that pace, but other members of the audience just love to kind of get in there. And it's a bit like going to an art gallery. There's a lot of space around you, and you can see the characters for what they are, and then start to project your own thoughts onto them and to engage creatively with their journeys. So hopefully that space allows you to do that.
I absolutely love the way you put that, because like you're right, in an art gallery there's like a lot of negative space with a very small portion focused on the art itself, but the way you direct the feast, like you just go in and like zoom in on this art, and you refuse to let the audience go. Like we have to be looking at it, even if we're 100 feet away or 3 inches away. Like we're always just there with it. And I think that comes from your direction and the screenplay and everyone's performance. Like it just holds you there and it makes you want to think. And I really love that.
Yeah, no, that's great. That was the intention, And I love speaking to people who kind of who get it, because there are lots of ideas in it as well. So, and I think that can be quite intimidating. But hopefully the space is there to kind of to consider these ideas and to kind of think about it.
Yeah, you definitely let it breathe, which is great.
You what? Sorry.
You let it breathe. Like you don't put everything like you like decant to one, kind of like it's allowing to breathe, and just like you're allowed to like bathe in like the essence of the movie, and then we start seeing it piece together and come together.
And then of course it becomes crazy at the end.
Yeah, then it becomes just absolute madness, and just really hones in on everything, and it's fabulous.
Great. No, good.
What would you say your biggest challenges were, like being this being your first time directing a feature versus doing syndicated TV and television, like having to make sure like everything is hit in that like tight either 27 or 45 minute like time frame you have, whereas with a feature you have an idea of how long you want it to be, but you aren't tied to anything necessarily?
No, I mean, I guess the greatest challenge was also the greatest joy. In a way, one side sort of embraced the challenge, which is the tyranny of freedom. As a television director, I'm often sent out to gather shots and get coverage, and I think this is more prevalent in the US than it is in the UK. But as a television director in the US, my understanding is that you sort of gather the shots, and then you go into the edit, and you have 3 or 4 days in the edit, and then you hand it over to the executive producers. Making this film was the opposite of that.
Yeah.
I literally had nobody. I was pleasing myself and the actors and the writer, Roger. And that was it, really. But of course, at first, that freedom is terrifying, because one is not used to it. And then as the day or the hours pass on the first day, and you're like, okay, I can just shoot this scene as I want to shoot it and as I see it in my imagination. And then it's incredibly liberating, So I didn't shoot a lot of coverage on this film, and in a way that was a good thing, because it was quite a tight schedule. It was 18 days. I was literally shooting what we see on screen, And that's incredibly creative as well, because you're making decisions on the floor. You're not postponing the creative process to the edit. So as a consequence, the edit was quite short as well, because we didn't need that much time, because a lot of that thinking had been done previously on set and in the preparation process. So yeah, it was, and that was a joy. That was a real joy. And that was the biggest challenge was also the biggest joy.
Okay, that's great to hear. One final question for you. Now that you've done the feature and would you consider doing more features in the future? You want to stick with TV? You want to still have that balance? Where do you see yourself moving forward in your career after The Feast, and how great it turned out for you?
Oh, I mean, I love film. I think it's, I love the sort of the purity of it in a way. It's a bit like perfume. It's or an essential oil. It's very sort of, it's a story distilled down to its sort of essence. But there's also a joy, of course, in doing a long form series where you do get to explore the characters and the relationships a little more. So a balance, a really healthy balance. But I'd love to make another film, and hopefully, I have a few ideas bubbling away, and yeah, let's see what happens.
Sounds good. Any insight onto what those ideas could be? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it may very well involve another horror film. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say.
Totally fair.
But a rather sort of zeitgeisty horror film, and maybe not set in Wales. I don't know. We'll see.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lee.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm really pleased you enjoyed the film. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Have a good one. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.